I've been a delivery driver for years, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was just past midnight when I got the order, a large, expensive meal from an upscale restaurant. The destination? A house right next to the old Oakwood Cemetery. As I pulled up to the address, the fog rolled in, thick and heavy. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the crumbling tombstones. I grabbed the food and approached the house, my shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. The man who answered the door was odd. Tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to bore right through me. He was dressed in an outdated suit like something from a century ago. As I handed him the food, his cold fingers brushed against mine, sending a chill down my spine. "Did you see anything on your way here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, confused. "No, sir, just fog." He nodded slowly, a strange smile creeping across his face. "Good, that's good. You should leave now, quickly." As I turned to go, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Little did I know, my night was about to take a turn for the horrifying. I hurried back to my car, eager to leave the unsettling encounter behind. But as I reached for the door handle, a movement caught my eye. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw something that made my blood run cold. Dark figures were moving among the graves. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their forms blurring in the fog. I blinked hard, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, there were more of them. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house. The man stood in the window, watching me. No, not watching me, watching the figures in the cemetery. That's when it hit me. The expensive meal, the strange questions, the man's outdated appearance. The food wasn't for him. It was for them. I slammed on the gas, tires screeching as I peeled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figures turn towards the sound. Their faces, if you could call them that, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to hunger for something I couldn't comprehend. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some elaborate Halloween prank. But deep down, I knew it was something far more sinister. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark figures gliding between the tombstones. The man's words echoed in my head. "Did you see anything on your way here?" The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At work, I jumped at every shadow, half expecting to see those hollow-faced figures lurking in dark corners. My coworkers noticed my jittery behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. Who would believe me? As my shift ended, I received another order for the same address. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't go back there. I wouldn't. But before I could refuse, my manager handed me the bag, insisting I take it. The drive to the cemetery felt like a nightmare. The fog was even thicker this time, swallowing the road ahead. As I approached the house, I saw movement in the graveyard again. But this time, the figures weren't just gliding, they were gathering, forming a circle around something I couldn't quite make out. With trembling hands, I knocked on the door. The same man answered, but he looked different. More gaunt, almost translucent in the pale moonlight. He took the food without a word, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, following his gaze, and my heart nearly stopped. The figures from the cemetery were closer now, hovering at the edge of the property. Their empty faces seemed to stare right through me, filled with an ancient, insatiable hunger. "What are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man sighed, a sound filled with centuries of weariness. "They are the hungry ones, souls trapped between worlds, forever seeking sustenance." "And the food?" I asked, dreading the answer. "A temporary appeasement," he replied. "But their hunger always returns." As if on cue, an unearthly wail rose from the cemetery. The figures began to move towards us, their forms becoming more solid with each step. "You should not have returned," the man said, his voice tinged with regret. "They've caught your scent now. They won't stop until they've feasted." Panic gripped me. I turned to run, but the man's cold hand clamped around my wrist. "Wait," he said. "There might be a way to save you." The man pulled me inside, slamming the door just as the first of the hungry ones reached the porch. Their hollow moans filled the air, sending shivers down my spine. "Listen carefully," the man said, his eyes wild with urgency. I've been holding them at bay for centuries, but I'm growing weak. I need a successor, someone to continue the vigil. I shook my head, unable to comprehend what he was saying. I don't understand. What do you mean? He pressed an ancient, leather-bound book into my hands. This contains the knowledge you'll need, the rituals, the offerings. It's the only way to keep them from breaking free and devouring the living. Outside, the wailing grew louder. The windows rattled in their frames as the hungry ones threw themselves against the house. I can't do this, I protested. I'm just a delivery driver. The man's form began to fade, becoming translucent. You have no choice now. They've marked you. Take up the vigil, or they'll consume everything you love. With a final, ethereal smile, he vanished completely. I was alone in the house, clutching the book, surrounded by the ravenous howls of the hungry ones. As I write this, I'm still here, learning the rituals, preparing the offerings. The responsibility weighs heavily on me, but I know the consequences of failure. So I stand guard, the last line of defense against an ancient, insatiable hunger. And I pray that no unsuspecting delivery driver ever again makes the mistake of bringing an order to this cursed address. As a delivery driver, I've seen my fair share of strange houses, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last Tuesday. It was a crisp autumn evening, and I had one last package to drop off before calling it a day. The address led me to the outskirts of town, down a winding road I'd never traveled before. As I approached the house, my stomach knotted. The Victorian-style mansion loomed before me, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. Overgrown weeds choked the front yard, and a rusted gate creaked in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. Swallowing my unease, I grabbed the package and made my way up the crumbling steps. The porch groaned under my weight, and I noticed cobwebs clinging to every corner. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the doorbell. Did anyone even live here? Just as I was about to turn back, the door creaked open. I nearly dropped the package in shock when I saw a young boy, no older than 10, peering up at me. His pale face was framed by messy dark hair, and his eyes seemed too large for his gaunt features. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you here with a delivery?" I nodded, struggling to find my voice. "Yes, I have a package for this address. Are your parents home?" The boy's lips curled into a small smile. "They'll be back soon. You can leave it with me." Something about the boy's demeanor sent chills down my spine, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I handed him the package, noticing how cold his hands were as our fingers briefly touched. He thanked me softly and began to close the door. Just then, a gust of wind blew past us, and I caught a glimpse of the interior. The hallway was dark and dusty, with peeling wallpaper and broken picture frames. It looked like no one had lived there for years. "Wait," I called out, my curiosity overriding my better judgment. "Are you sure you're okay here by yourself? It doesn't look like anyone's been living here for a while." The boy's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something in them. Fear, sadness, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We've always lived here," he replied, his voice eerily calm, "always and forever." Before I could respond, he shut the door with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. The whole encounter left me feeling unsettled, but I couldn't exactly call the police because a child was home alone. Still, as I walked back to my van, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I sat in my vehicle, staring at the house. The windows seemed to stare back, dark and empty. As I was about to start the engine, I noticed movement in an upstairs window. A curtain twitched, and for a split second, I saw a woman's face peering out. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a jolt of fear. Her face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. Then she was gone, the curtain falling back into place. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I had imagined it. The stress of the day must be getting to me, I thought. But as I drove away, the image of that face stayed with me, haunting my thoughts long after I'd left the old house behind. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to get the image of the boy and the decrepit house out of my mind. The woman's face in the window kept appearing in my thoughts, her hollow eyes seeming to follow me even in the darkness of my bedroom. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and decided to do some research on the address. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been abandoned for over 30 years. The last family to live there, the Harrises, had died in a tragic car accident in 1989. Their bodies were found, but their 10-year-old son, Timothy, was never recovered. My hands shook as I scrolled through old newspaper articles. There was a picture of the family, and the boy in it was unmistakably the same child I had seen earlier that day. But what shocked me even more was the photo of his mother. It was the same gaunt face I had seen in the upstairs window. I read on, my horror growing. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of paranormal activity in the house. People claimed to see lights flickering in the windows, hear childish laughter echoing through the empty rooms, and some even reported seeing a small boy watching them from the upstairs window. The house had been dubbed the Harris Haunt by locals, and no one had lived there since the tragedy. So how had I delivered a package there, and who had ordered it? As I delved deeper into the history of the house, I found more disturbing details. There were reports of other delivery drivers experiencing similar encounters over the years. Some claimed to have seen the boy, others the mother, but all described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon approaching the house. I closed my laptop, my mind reeling. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? Sleep was out of the question now. I paced my apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a coincidence. Maybe a homeless child had taken shelter in the abandoned house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to go back to the house. I needed to see it in the daylight to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The house looked even more dilapidated in the morning light. Paint chips littered the overgrown lawn, and several windows were smashed. My heart raced as I approached the front door, half expecting the ghostly boy to answer again. But there was no answer to my knock. The door was locked tight, and peering through a broken window, I saw only dust and cobwebs inside. There was no sign that anyone, living or dead, had been there recently. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, on the porch where I had stood the night before, was the package I had delivered. It was unopened, covered in a thick layer of dust as if it had been sitting there for years. With trembling hands, I picked it up. The shipping label was faded and yellowed, but I could just make out the date, October 15th, 1989, the day before the Harris family's fatal accident. I stumbled back to my car, the package clutched to my chest. My mind was reeling, trying to process what this all meant. Had I somehow slipped through time yesterday? Or had the ghost of Timothy Harris reached out across the decades, waiting for this package to finally arrive? I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to pretend none of this had ever happened, to throw away the package and never think about the Harris house again. But I knew I wouldn't be able to live with the uncertainty. With shaking hands, I opened the package. Inside was a small, worn teddy bear and a letter, the paper brittle with age. The letter was from Timothy's grandmother, wishing him a happy birthday and apologizing for not being able to visit. The date on the letter was October 16th, 1989, the day of the accident. Tears welled up in my eyes as the full weight of the tragedy hit me. This gift had never reached Timothy in life, and now, decades later, his spirit had been waiting to receive it. I made a decision then. I walked back to the house and placed the teddy bear and letter on the porch. "I'm sorry it took so long, Timothy," I whispered. "You can rest now." As I turned to leave, I swear I heard a child's laughter on the wind, and for a brief moment, I saw Timothy's smiling face in the upstairs window. Then, like a mirage, the image faded away, leaving only the empty, silent house behind. Being a delivery driver in this city isn't the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. I've seen my fair share of weird addresses and odd customers, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last Friday night. It was just past midnight when I got an order from a new Italian place downtown. The instructions were crystal clear. Do not leave the food outside. Hand delivery only. No big deal, I thought. I punched the address into my GPS and set off. The neighborhood seemed normal at first, but as I turned onto the street, things started feeling off. The streetlights were dim, barely illuminating the crumbling sidewalks. I slowed down, squinting at house numbers until I found the right one. My heart sank. The house looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in years. Paint peeled off the weathered siding, and half the windows were boarded up. The front yard was a jungle of overgrown weeds, with rusted junk peeking through the tall grass. This couldn't be right. I double-checked the address, but there was no mistake. This decrepit, abandoned-looking house was my destination. I sat in my car, debating what to do. The hand delivery only instruction echoed in my mind. With a deep breath, I grabbed the food and stepped out. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I approached the porch. Each step on the creaky wood made me more uneasy. Standing at the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The peeling paint revealed rotting wood underneath, and the brass knocker was green with age. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. Something about this place felt fundamentally wrong. I decided to call the customer instead. As I pulled out my phone, a faint sound from inside the house made me freeze. It was a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor. My pulse quickened. I dialed the number quickly, praying for an answer. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, I heard a click, but instead of a voice, all I could hear was heavy breathing. It seemed to be coming from both the phone and somewhere inside the house. A chill ran down my spine. "Hello," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm here with your delivery." The breathing on the phone grew louder, more ragged. Then, from deep within the house, I heard a thump, and another, like footsteps, getting closer to the door. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. The footsteps grew louder, and I could have sworn I saw the doorknob start to turn. That was it. I dropped the food, turned, and ran as fast as I could back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale face watching me from one of the windows. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to calm my nerves. Eventually, I pulled over and called my supervisor to report what happened. He sounded skeptical, but said he'd look into it. I finished my shift in a daze, jumping at every little noise. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just an old house and my imagination got the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I received a call from my supervisor. His voice was tense as he asked me to come into the office immediately. When I arrived, I found him with 2 police officers. My stomach dropped. "We need to ask you some questions about your delivery last night," one of the officers said, his expression grim. They showed me a picture of the house I had visited. In the daylight, it looked even more decrepit. "Are you sure this is the house you went to?" the officer asked. I nodded, my mouth dry. "What's going on?" The officers exchanged a look before the second one spoke. "That house has been abandoned for over a decade. It was the scene of a brutal murder-suicide in 2010. The family that lived there, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But I heard noises inside, and on the phone." The first officer leaned forward. "That's impossible. The utilities were cut off years ago. There's no active phone line to that address." I sat there, stunned. If there was no phone line, who or what had I heard breathing on the other end of the call? The revelation left me reeling. I couldn't reconcile what I had experienced with what the police were telling me. They asked more questions, but I had no answers. Just a growing sense of dread. After leaving the office, I couldn't resist. I had to go back to that house in daylight. As I drove down the street, my palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. The house looked different in the harsh light of day, but no less menacing. I parked across the street, staring at the decaying structure. Suddenly, movement caught my eye. A curtain in one of the upper windows twitched, as if someone had quickly stepped away. My heart raced. I blinked, and the curtain was still again. Was I losing my mind? I was about to leave when an elderly woman approached my car. She introduced herself as a longtime resident of the neighborhood. "I saw you looking at the old Miller house," she said, her eyes sad. Terrible thing that happened there. I asked her about the family, and her story confirmed what the police had said. But then she lowered her voice. "The strangest thing is, sometimes at night, people swear they see lights on in there. And on the anniversary of the incident, some say they hear screams." A chill ran through me. "Has anyone ever investigated?" The old woman shook her head. "Police have been there countless times, never found a thing. But let me tell you, young man, there are some things in this world that can't be explained. Some places hold on to the darkness that happened there." I couldn't get the old woman's words out of my head. Over the next few weeks, I found myself driving by the house almost every night after my shift. I never saw any lights, never heard any screams, but the sense of wrongness never faded. One night, about a month after my initial delivery, I received another order for that same address. My blood ran cold as I stared at the familiar instructions. "Do not leave the food outside, hand delivery only." I should have refused the order. I should have told my supervisor. Instead, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I accepted it. As I pulled up to the house, my headlights illuminated a figure standing on the porch. My heart pounded as I approached. It was a man, his features obscured by shadows. "I have your delivery," I called out, my voice trembling. The figure stepped forward and I gasped. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. When he spoke, his voice was a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for you to come back," he said, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. "Won't you come inside? We have so much to share." I stumbled backward, dropping the food. As I ran to my car, I heard multiple voices laughing behind me, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet night. I quit my job the next day. I moved out of the city soon after. But no matter how far I go, I can't shake the memory of that house, or the lingering feeling that something there is still waiting for me to return.